Good afternoon and welcome back to Early Modern Europe. Today's lecture is going to be a bit of a prologue to the entire story of the French Revolution. Because in order for us to make sense of the French Revolution, we need to take a step back. And you're thinking, well, of course we do. It's Dr. Grant. You can't do anything without taking a step back first. And that's true, because we need to set this into the proper context. And we also need to set the entire story into a theoretical context. And that theoretical context is revolution. What is a revolution? What does it look like? What does it act like? What are the criteria? Because we can't just say that everything in which there is some kind of political upheaval is a revolution. The word has to mean something. Because when you think about it, what a revolution is simply something going around once, right? It revolves. That's what it means. And so a revolution is a turning around or a turning of events. But that's not what we mean. That's not the whole story, obviously. That's not why we use the word. And so what I want to do to start, to get us going, is to lay out some criteria about what a revolution might be. And that will help us, especially when we're dealing with this thing that we're calling the French Revolution. It's also why I often talked about the English Civil Wars as civil wars and not a revolution. Others will call what happened in England during that period of time a revolution. I don't. And the reason I don't is because fundamentally, things were not radically changed before and after. Except Parliament had more power. And so we have to ask ourselves, is the French Revolution a revolution? You're thinking, well, if it's not a revolution, then what is? That's a good question. And I hope that in thinking through these criteria, it may help. All right, now, I did not cook these up out of my own feverish little imagination. These come from a really solid historian named Harold Berman. He was a historian of the law, in fact. He's a legal scholar, first and foremost. And in his explorations of the history of law in all of its myriad forms, one of the things he realized is that law is inextricably linked with the notion of revolution, with the notion of change, really. And so he lays out in a book called Law and Revolution what it means. And this is really helpful for us. And so Harold Berman's criteria are a great place to start. And so the first thing that he talks about is that we're talking about change, but very specific kinds of change. And he talks about the fact that there's a difference between revolution and evolution. Both of them involve change. One involves change over a long period of time through the natural forces of adaptation and growth. That's different from a revolution. And so he's going to talk about change in four ways. The first type of change is that it must be fundamental change, that at the very root of the society, what you're talking about, things are going to be different. This isn't tinkering around the edges. This isn't essentially kind of incremental change. This is the whole system. The whole system gets thrown up into the air, and what lands is something different. That's what we mean by fundamental change. This is why, if you're going to seek fundamental change, a complete reworking of the systems and the institutions as we know them, then you have to be careful, or you at least have to acknowledge that everything changes, not just the things that you want to change. And see, and that's the talk in revolutionaries, that we always have to ask the question, do they know what they're unleashing and how widespread it is going to be? Because as we saw with the Reformation, Harold Berman actually calls that a revolution. With the Reformation, once you've opened the door to change, you don't know where people are going to stop. And you don't know where people are going to go. And you certainly can't control them. Once you've opened the door to change, it's going to continue until it finds a place to stay or to rest, or it burns itself out. So fundamental change is the first type. And again, this is in order for it to be a revolution. So you need to have all four of these, right? Not just one or two of them. It's all of them. All right. The second is rapid change. And that makes perfect sense. If it's not rapid change, then it is just an evolution. Then it is just a slow progression or growth or adaptation to environment. That's not a revolution. That's just called change, right? And so in order for it to be a revolution, it's got to be rapid. It's got to just happen, almost in the blink of an eye. And so then we have to ask ourselves, so how much time is rapid? And that's always the point, right? All of these you can quibble with. All of these you can kind of parse and try to define, and that's a part of the exercise, right? These are criteria, and in order for criteria to make sense, you have to test them, right? It's an interesting thing that one of the revolutions that Berman listed in his book was the Russian Revolution. And he wrote the book in 1983 when the Soviet Union still looked as, from the outside, as powerful as possible. Within 10 years of that book, the Soviet Union was gone. Poof. And so we have to ask ourselves, how effective was the Russian Revolution? Because the next one on the list makes you wonder. Permanent. The change must be permanent. And that's a real tough question, especially in regard to the French Revolution that we're going to be talking about today. Which revolution are you going to say is permanent? Because again, maybe what we want to say instead of the French Revolution is to talk about the French revolutions, plural. Go back to the example of the Russian Revolution. When the Bolsheviks took over, and then it was Lenin, and then Stalin, and all the rest. Is it a permanent revolution if the revolution fails after 80 years? Right? That's a question that we need to ask. And so permanent. But you can see what Berman is doing here. You can see the kinds of wheels that he wants to get us thinking of, turning, so that we can think about these various component pieces. because he wants to be exact. He wants to be careful with the words that we use. That way we won't overuse words like revolution, right? The last one, and again, maybe we need to be certain to talk about these revolutions in terms of political, but they're also social and economic and religious. You can see how this all weaves together. So the fourth one, and this is one that he just absolutely says you've got to have, right, is it must be a violent change. And that's hard, right? That's hard for us to kind of swallow, because what do you mean violence is a necessary requirement? Well, there are two ways of thinking about it. In order for this to be fundamental, it's got to be something that people are willing to fight for or fight against. Something that people are willing to die for, an idea that they're willing to die for. Contrarily, an idea they're willing to kill for. And I want you to let that sink in, because that's a big idea. An idea so big, so profound, so all-encompassing that you're willing to put your life on the line for it. This is what he was talking about. You're not going to get violence if it's not fundamental. Violence is going to create the rapidity in many ways. What violence is going to really inhibit, though, is the possibility of its permanence. Because again, violence in human society is like a contagion. Once it's burning its way through the body politic, it's tough to dampen that fever. We see it right now, right? Tempers are flaring, passions are high, but we haven't seen violence yet. Not systematic, not widespread. A lot of posturing and some unfortunate issues, right? And I'm not downplaying those at all, but from a historical perspective, from a sociological perspective, we haven't seen the kind of violence that Berman is talking about. And for that, I am very glad, because that's when things spiral out of control. And one of the things that we recognize in the French Revolution is how much violence is going to play a role in all of this. And we have to ask ourselves, was it worth it? Because you see, the French Revolution isn't as neat and tidy as the musicals on Broadway might have us believe. It is a mess, and there's no mistaking it. Now, I will argue very clearly that the system that was in place prior to the revolution had to come to an end. Had to. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. That's what today is essentially for, once we get through these criteria. It was a disaster for the vast majority of people. The people who were in the aristocracy, the people who were the monarchs, they were fine. But they were the 1%. Make no mistake about it. And that meant there were a lot of people, the vast majority of people, who were crushed by that system. That was the fundamental change that had to take place. It was categorically inequitable, unfair, oppressive, cruel. But I'm not sure whether what replaced it, especially in the short term, was all that much better. Things to think about, right? All right, so we've got our fundamental, rapid, permanent, and violent change. Those are the first 4 criteria. Now, the other part of Berman's argument, and I love the way he sets this up, is that the other thing that a revolution needs is legitimacy. And he lists 3 basic ideas that what makes a new regime legitimate? What grounds it? How does it ground itself? How does it explain itself? How does it prove that it's legit, that its authority and its power come from a real place and not just by fiat, right? We have power because we say we have power. See, because most people don't believe that. We want to believe that any ruling authority is grounded in something. We believe that in the American Revolution. They're going to try to articulate this in the French Revolution. We saw that in the earliest arguments in the Protestant Reformation, which again, Berman calls a revolution. We saw that in the upheaval in the Russian Revolution. And Berman actually includes the English Civil Wars as a revolution. Again, I don't think there's fundamental change. I think there's evolutionary change in the English Civil Wars. I just have never really quite bought the notion that it was a pure revolution. But here's the thing. Legitimacy is a really important understanding component of the whole business of a revolution. The new people who are claiming, hey, we should be in power. Okay, why? Why should you be in power? That's what legitimacy means, right? We go through this in our elections. That's what we're doing right now. One side is absolutely saying, you didn't actually, and of course it's not true, right? There's no argument to support what President Trump and his supporters are doing right now. None. There isn't. There's no legal merit. There's no proof of wrongdoing. There's a heck of a lot of people who voted very clearly in the right way in the United States through the whole business of the Electoral College. There's no there, right? There's no legitimacy to their argument. They've got nothing to hang their hats on except an impulse to want to be in power. Well, that's not enough. It's never been enough. Nobody ever gets to just say, now I'm in charge. You have to prove your case. Now, in years past, that may have simply been that you're better on the battlefield than the other person. But that's still legitimacy. You still have shown an argument. Maybe not the best argument, but you've shown an argument, right? This is why we're going to go through, and during the Roman Empire, you're going to get whole swaths of periods where emperors are going to get killed one after another. And mostly it's because it's all factionalist nonsense in which they are asserting a claim that has no basis, that has no legitimacy. And so every time somebody takes power, they have to explain why, what difference it makes and where they claim their authority. In American elections, we say that legitimacy comes from, and this is a lovely old phrase, the consent of the governed. The people who voted say, yep, you're in charge. Now, throughout all of our history up until this point, essentially people are like, oh, okay. And if your side loses, you go, well, that sucks. That's not what I wanted. I'm disappointed. But consent of the governed, that's the way it works. That's how it's been done all along, right? In the United States, that's how it works. We vote. That's where legitimacy is drawn from. It's drawn from the people. The people speak with a voice, and you listen to it. And this year, right? And I hate to be political, but it's just the way it is. From a historical perspective, we are off the map. It's bizarre, right? Just from electoral considerations. More people in the right systems, i.e. the Electoral College, voted for Joe Biden. They did, right? Now, in every other election, the other side would be like, oh, that sucks. Happens all the time. Happens every election. Somebody loses. And minus the actual evidence of shenanigans, voter fraud, whatever you want to call it, minus actual evidence, that you gotta take that one. You gotta say, oh, okay, I'll take the L and then I'll go home, and then you try again. That's what you do, right? Nobody likes to lose, but in the American system, that's the way it works. That's legitimacy, the consent of the governed. And we spell that out through election law and all the other kind of stuff. If there were actual evidence, not just, whatever has been spoken, but actual evidence, real, verifiable, fact-checkable evidence, things that can go to court and everybody goes, ooh, yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Minus all of that, there's no legitimacy. Because in our system, you can't just assert a win. You have to show your work. It's like mathematics, right? You have to prove your legitimacy. And the legitimacy comes through one very clear angle. Consent of the governed, based on election law. If you want to overturn an election, if you want to prove that that actually didn't happen, then you got to show your work, all of it, and legitimately, and walk patiently through the evidence. It's not exciting. It's not a lot of fun, but it's the way our system works. Because, and here's the thing, right? And you're thinking, Dr. Grant, could you please get off your political soapbox? But see, actually, I'm making a historical point. Because the first bit of legitimacy for Berman is a fundamental law. You have to follow a fundamental, there's got to be a rock solid foundational piece of legal thinking in order for you to have any legitimacy, right? In the case of the fight between king and parliament, both sides are saying, oh, no. Our law states that this is who is in charge, or this is who has power over these certain things. And if you're stepping over the bounds of that, then you got to show me where in the law this makes sense. And so every revolution must ground itself, must legitimize itself with this notion of fundamental law. Why are you claiming authority? Where's your evidence? What's your proof? And what concept is it that you are upholding? And that's a huge thing. That is not something that you can just throw overboard. In the American Revolution, the idea was that we should govern ourselves, that we should not be governed by a king across the ocean, that he wasn't here, that he didn't know what was going on, that he had no conceptualization. And that fundamentally, remember, these are English citizens after the English Civil Wars, that their responsibility is to governing themselves. Now, what they're going to do is they're going to rummage around in the Roman Republic and the Greek demos for historical grounding in all of this. And they're going to track this through the history of the legal tradition. That has a lot of weight. And it shows you where the foundation is laid. You can see it, you can point to it, and you can conceptualize it. That's really important. This is not just yanking something out of the clear blue sky and saying, this is why I'm legit. Now, I've just tipped my hat to the second part, right? And so if the first one is a fundamental law, the second is a remote past. It's an appeal to history, essentially. It's an appeal to an authority that moves beyond our common everyday stuff by saying that there is an idea or an ideal that has been tested by time, and that we reach all the way back and bring that forward. It does two things. One, it says this idea, this important nugget has been around for so long, right? It has withstood the test of time. This is not something that's just a fly-by-night idea of the youth or whatever. This is something that's been around forever. And human beings are very attuned to that part of the argument. That its very age speaks to its legitimacy. It's why all of our architecture in Washington, D.C. is Greek or Roman and a bit of Egyptian, because it's ancient. Because it evokes that notion that this is not something that we've just created out of nothing in this particular moment. The other thing appealing to the remote past does is that it removes the stain of innovation. People still don't like change. You're thinking, Dr. Grant, you're giving this lecture on your laptop computer with this wonderful program that you are then going to take the recording of, upload it to the internet, and then we're going to watch half of it maybe while we're doing other things. Right? This way of teaching is novel, except it's not. The technology has changed. But make no mistake, the idea is the same. It's me teaching a lesson to my students. It's the oldest way of doing education in the books. People have been trying to blow up and get rid of lectures I don't know, probably since the first student fell asleep in class, however many thousands of years ago. But it's a way of imparting information. The technology is different, but the impulse certainly isn't. Because we're allergic to change. And so if we can locate something in this remote past, we can say to people, see, I'm not just making this stuff up. This isn't something that's just kind of flying around, the internet right now. This is something that has been around forever. I'm not changing things. I'm just telling you how the way it's supposed to work. In the Reformation, they had the phrase ad fontes, back to the sources, right? What was that if not an appeal to a remote past? Every single revolution is going to do that. And they're going to say, see, what we're doing is that we're not creating something new. We're just returning it to the way it should be, the way it was at some point way back there. Now, there's an ancillary idea to that remote past. And that is, and this isn't a part of Berman stuff, but I've always added it. Usually when you get people waxing eloquent about a remote past, they're going to bring up the Golden Age. That period of time when everything just worked. It was awesome. Society functioned beautifully. Everybody obeyed the law. Innovation was for the good, right? They made pop mass culture that I enjoyed and that spoke to our values and blah, blah, blah. A golden age. And the interesting thing about a golden age is that I'm sure it was a golden age for the person remembering it. But you have to ask yourself, was it golden for everybody? Probably not. Political campaigns, right? Again, allow me to look at the most recent one. President Trump ran on the appeal of Make America Great Again. It implied there was a time, and it's a very specific one, that he was pointing back to. His remote past isn't all that remote. His golden age sits very comfortably in the 1950s. You know why? Women hadn't fully moved into the workplace. The civil rights movement hadn't really gotten started yet. The 1950s was a golden age for white men, especially white men with property. That was a golden age. That was when everything was perfect. They were in control of everything. That was the time. Yeah, I understand why a lot of people his age and white want to go back there, wanted to go back there, wanted to try to recreate that, because they were in control. Now, interestingly enough, the issue of a golden age is that, again, not golden for everybody. And in fact, probably only golden for a very small sliver of the population. And so that golden age never existed, except in their eyes. The other problem with the remote past, or a benefit, I suppose, if you think about it, is that you never had to live in it. Which means that you can make that time period say whatever you want it to. And there's where education makes a difference, especially historical education. If people don't know the past, if they don't know history, if they've never explored it, guess what? Those who have can say whatever they want because you don't know any different and you can't contradict them. This is why throughout a lot of human history, people in charge really don't want people not in charge to know much. It's why slave owners did not want those who were enslaved to learn how to read and write. Because nothing is more dangerous than somebody who's educated, who knows, and can ask questions. The more people who don't know about history and don't care to find out will be victimized by those who say that they do. Because the other problem is that a lot of the history that I hear nowadays, especially out of politicians and other ideologues, is just bad history. It's distorted, it's wrong, it's fundamentally flawed. But people won't know that if they've never studied it. They won't even know the questions to ask to get started. And so a remote past is often a very convenient thing to ground your legitimacy in because people don't know any better. Oh no, back then, everything was run this way and it worked and society was awesome and it was a golden age. It was perfect. It was awesome. Oh, really? Oh, wow, that's awesome. That's great. Well, let's get back there. Not knowing anything about that. And certainly not knowing enough to ask questions. So we have to be careful, right? But you can see how this all folds, this circle, right? How it all fits into place. All right, last thing for this. So you need a fundamental law for legitimacy. You got to have a remote past. Reach all the way back. And make it up if you've got to. That's what Augustus did at the beginning of the Roman Empire, right? He didn't call himself the emperor. He called himself the first citizen, the first princeps. It's awesome, right? I'm just a citizen. Shut up. Get out of here. But he did commission Virgil, the epic poet, to write the Aeneid. And the Aeneid is essentially the story of Aeneas going all the way back to the Trojan War, the last hero of the Trojans fleeing the burning city as Greece lays waste to the fabled city of Troy, and Aeneas escapes. And it's all about his journeys all around the Mediterranean until he finally lands on the Italian peninsula. And a couple generations down the way, his descendants found the fabled city of Rome. And so they ground the new empire in a story that says, really, we're the last descendants of the Trojans. God, isn't that awesome? You've just given yourself a mythic past that's heartbreaking and heroic and valiant, struggling against all the odds of all of these things, and Aeneas's travels and wanderings, and the gods themselves told him where he would finally settle. God, that's a story to hang a new regime on, isn't it? Isn't that awesome? It's one of the great epic poems of all of Western history. And Virgil essentially wrote it as a piece of propaganda for a new empire, as they were trying to say, no, the empire's okay. We're good. I know, we just lost the republic. Don't worry about it. He's not an empire. He's not an emperor. He's not a king. He's the first citizen, and this is where we're grounded. Oh my God, it's perfect, right? What an awesome piece of work. What a complete fabrication, right? But if you tell the story enough, that becomes the only story that people know. And the Romans at the time didn't, so many of them were not literate. They wouldn't know where to even begin to find out what actually happened or why Augustus was yanking their chain. It's amazing. It really is. Stunning stuff. All right, so fundamental law, remote past, last one. Little problem with T's and I's there. An apocalyptic future. Now, an apocalypse, we need to be very careful about that word. You, likely as not, have been using it wrong because, frankly, most of society gets it wrong. Most of society, most pop culture especially, uses it wrong. It just is, right? We talk about an apocalyptic future, and we usually think of some grand catastrophe or cataclysm that happens and society rebuilds itself. That's not what it means, right? That's, maybe you can go, it's not apocalypse. An apocalypse, the word simply means to reveal. Like the book of Revelation is called the Apocalypse of John because apocalypse means to reveal. Now, it reveals something cosmic or divine, but make no mistake, it's not synonymous with disaster or cataclysm. I know, I'm no fun. I'm absolutely no fun, but that's just the way it is. An apocalyptic future means that something has been revealed, and that's what we're going to create. We're going to create something new, something different, something perfect. Right? The revelation of St. John is that a new Jerusalem comes down out of heaven after the old order is swept away. The disaster isn't the apocalypse, the new Jerusalem. That's the vision. That's the revelation. That's the revealing of what God's plan is for everything else. That in the book of Revelation, that's how it works, right? That there happens to be a grand battle and all that kind of stuff is completely sidelined. That's not the thing. And so when we talk about post-apocalyptic, blah, 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 I always get confused by that because a battle's not necessary. A cataclysm is not necessary. A new future, though, a revealed future of some form of perfection or all the rest, that's what we're talking about, right? That's a difference. And I really want you to hang on to that because that word has been wildly abused. It's just wrong. And I get to say that because both from the historical side and from the religious side of my studies, it's just incorrect. And so I'm going to be wildly pedantic about that, right? But it is new. And it's supposedly going to be perfect for everybody. And so you can probably start to think of what that apocalyptic future, that thing way off in the distance, is going to become. Our society is going to heal the wounds, and we're going to lift up the oppressed, and the economic systems are going to be leveled, right? Not blown apart. I mean, everybody is going to be equitable. I mean, that's what a lot of them are talking about. Or that rights are going to be even across the board, that we're going to have economic justice or political justice, all of those kinds of things. Those are really important because those are the goals. Those are the goals that we are reaching for. We're not doing this just for power, right? That's, again, really very important. This isn't just to replace one set of rulers with another. That's just evolution. In order for it to be a revolution, there must be a new day, a new era, a new moment in human history. And that goes back to the notion of that fundamental change. If it's just the same thing with new characters, that ain't a revolution. And so that's where we start. And that's really important because the system that we're looking at, which we need to do now, the ancient regime, this is the old order, the old regime. It's the social, political, economic system which existed in most of Europe during the 17th and into the 18th centuries. And frankly, it had been there for a very long time. In France, at least since, well, Charlemagne. Which means that this is fundamentally the same system that's been operating in France for about 1,000 years, 900 years-ish. And this is the system of absolutism. A monarch, a king, usually. There were some queens, but not in France, because France didn't allow women to rise to the throne. A monarch has absolute control over the government. Absolute. Right? And in France, there were essentially what we call the three estates. The first estate, right? So this is the division of socioeconomic and political power in society. The first estate were all the high-ranking members of the church. At the time of the revolution, that means about 130,000 people in the first estate. These are the bishops and cardinals and theological faculty and all the rest. You think, oh my goodness, it's a lot of people. Yeah, it really is. But then again, compared to the rest of the French population, not that significant. They were in charge of the church, and they were seamlessly integrated into the aristocracy. You could either, these are one of two paths. and they had been there for a very long time. And remember, if we go back all the way back to Charlemagne, Charlemagne believed that the king, in his case the emperor, was the head of the church. And so he did not separate church and state. The church essentially was the moral and spiritual arm of the state as far as he was concerned, and that it was his responsibility to keep the church safe. Kings and monarchs and aristocrats in France had essentially functioned that way all throughout. They always believed that they were in charge. I mean, look back at the Avignon papacy and the Great Schism, where the Philip the Fair firmly believed that it was his responsibility and his right to tell the church exactly what to do. And so the church had always been a part of the French aristocracy. All right, speaking of which, the second estate were the nobility. That's about 100,000, 110,000 people. These were the landed nobles. They had titles and they had land, and therefore they had wealth. And it was the various families throughout the whole course of French history rose to prominence, fell out of prominence, and at this particular time it was the Bourbon family, the Bourbon dynasty, who was in charge. But they always came out of this collection of nobles. These two estates controlled the vast majority of all of the land. Both the church and the nobility were landowners, and therefore they could tax and collect tithes and all of the rest. Everybody else essentially worked for those two, which leads to the third estate. And the third estate well, that's everybody else, all of us. Peasants in the countryside, the wealthy bourgeoisie, right? The burgeoning, the new middle class, all that kind of stuff, the merchants, traders, you name it. Everything, everybody else. If you weren't a priest or at least a bishop or a cardinal or a member of the nobility and all of their families, you were in the third estate. That's everybody else. And that's roughly 25 million people. Oh, here's a lovely cartoon from the time of the Revolution depicting exactly what the third estate thought about the other two. It's not subtle, is it? Right? First estate, second estate, third estate. That's the way it worked. That's France for a very long time. Very long time. On top of it all was the monarch, the king. And the French king, like some of the English kings, believed in the divine right of kings, right? The monarch ruled by divine right. God put the world in motion, and God put some people in positions of power. Power is given directly by God to these people. These were no fans of Marsilius de Padua's Defensor Pacis. I just want to say that right off the bat. There's a reason why so many monarchs and so many aristocrats looked at that and went, whoa, what are you talking about? No, that's not the way it works. They firmly believe in the top-down hierarchical model of power and authority and governance. God gives you the power. And since no one can question God, no one can question someone put in power by God. The very idea of questioning the monarchy was blasphemy because it meant that you were questioning God. That's where their legitimacy came from. I'm king because God said I'm king. And if you disagree with that, then you take it up with the Almighty. And let's see how you fare. Let's see how you do. That's what the divine right of kings was all about. And the French monarchs, absolutely, they believed this heart and soul. And the one who just absolutely nailed this down as a concept and as a reality is King Louis XIV. He ascended to the throne of France at the age of 4, and he will be the king for the next 72 years. I just let that sink in for a second. It's the longest monarchy in European history. And now, no, at the age of 4, he was not the one making the decisions. He was in his what we call minority. But he took over early on in his teens, and he never relinquished it. Now, this is not to say that they didn't try. They didn't, there were some very serious attempts when he was young. When he was 9 years old, the Parlement, which is not a parliament as we're thinking about in England. Parlement in France, these are provincial law courts, and there are 13 of them at the time of the French Revolution in the 18th century. So think of them as legal districts, right? When he was 9, one of the Parlement wanted to attack the prime minister, a guy named Jules Cardinal Mazarin. Cardinal is actually his title, Cardinal Mazarin. The aristocrats were getting a little frustrated with the First Estate. Cardinal Mazarin had been following on a program first initiated by his predecessor, a guy named Cardinal Richelieu. And these are great people. You should definitely go look them up, right? Because just fascinating characters in and of themselves. So Mazarin is trying to continue the program set up by Cardinal Richelieu, which sought to ensure French supremacy in Europe, as well as to cripple all the rivals of the Bourbon dynasty to the throne. And so here you have these high-level churchmen, right? Cardinals, who are acting as the prime minister, the one who is essentially governing in the stead of the king as he's growing up. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to make sure that nobody's going to challenge him for the throne, none of the other families, right? None of the aristocrats. And then also trying to essentially create a hierarchy of hierarchies, putting France at the very top. And so the Parlement were trying to fight against that, right? And so they rebelled against Mazarin and the ideas of Richelieu. The rebellion was put down. But in the meantime, Cardinal Mazarin was able to impress upon the very young Louis the need to vigorously support the church, especially the church in France. And so he fed him a steady diet of the church's teachings and the church's importance and the church's authority and its willingness to always support the crown. And oh, by the way, let's get you ready for what's going to come and make sure that you have a good, proper military background. He was priming him for rule, and he was trying to work the system so that the Bourbon dynasty was never going to be challenged. This is the beginning of King Louis's reign. And it's important to set it there because you can see how important it is to him to make sure that these particular levers of power are all right there for him. When Cardinal Mazarin died, Louis decided that now was a great time to consolidate all the power to the throne, and he assumed all the responsibilities for ruling the kingdom. All of them, which scared the daylights out of the other aristocrats because no other king had ever decided to take all of these various reigns of power and authority to get things done and all the decisions and all that kind of stuff. Nobody had ever decided to bring all of those into one person. But he declared that it was his right to do so because that right was God-given. And then he used all of that teaching of the church so very effectively because he turned right around and said, and any disobedience is not simply disobedience, it's actually sinful. You're working against God. You're working against the church. And so anybody who says, oh no, king, you can't, they could be punished. He controlled every aspect of governance, from legislation to theological disputes, from infrastructure to troop movements, all of it, everything. There wasn't anything outside of his purview, right? And you would think the aristocrats were going to blow a gasket, right? Wouldn't you? I would have. But he had a plan for them too. And it's simplicity itself, really. Instead of challenging all of the other noble families, he lured them in with every luxury and every enticement possible. He bought them off. And then he made sure that they knew they were bought off. Because that was going to keep them in line. So he sweet-talked them, brought them in, made them comfortable, gave them everything they could possibly want except for control, and then said, and I know what your tastes are. I know where all the bodies are buried, essentially. Everything that you know, everything that you thought was secret. No, I got it. But I'm not going to say anything. And you can continue to live this life of luxury. And they were his. Lock, stock, and barrel. Body and soul. Now, of course, there's a problem, as you can imagine. Weakening the aristocrats was a problem long term, right? Because when you had the aristocracy and when power was not shared so much as spread out a little bit, if somebody started screaming about something that was going wildly wrong, there was a vent for that dissatisfaction. You could blame some random aristocrat or government official or something like that. But with Louis taking up every last reign of power and authority and making all of these decisions on his own, well, that meant that there was going to be a lack of pressure release. Resentments in the population, they would build, and there wouldn't be anywhere to go with them, right? It would just sit there growing, that resentment, and there's no avenue to get rid of it. And that was a problem. Now, some other things that were going along in this, and not everything that he did was bad. I mean, he was a patron of the arts. He supported writers like Racine and Molière. He put up monuments and grand architecture everywhere. He beautified France. It's an interesting thing because that's what Augustus did at the beginning of the Roman Empire. He completely, right, transformed it into this thing of beauty. That's what Louis was doing. And he did it not only for the world to see and the French to appreciate, he did it for himself because he was creating an image. We often call him the Sun King because everybody revolved around him, and he was the light of France, right? And if you can impress people, right? Show them the grandeur, the beauty, the art and architecture, all the rest. Maybe they won't think so much about the fact that they don't have much. If you can distract them, right? Over here. Follow the little birdie, right? Bread in circuses is what they used to call it in the Roman period. Then people won't know how much they've lost or try to fight for it. One of the most ostentatious things that he did in this building spree was to add on to the Palace of Versailles. It was a nice estate. It was a lovely until he really started adding on to it. By the time he was done, it was of brain-bending size. 721,000 square feet. 721,000 square feet. All right, just to let you know, the average house in the United States is about 1,800 square feet. Right? Just let that sink in. And then think about how much that thing cost. Right? And there's going to be one of the other things about the Sun King is in order to pull off this grand show, they had to spend a lot of money. A lot of money they didn't have. And this cost for his lavish tastes is going to stagger the French economy for decades. But that wasn't his only interest, as it were. In 1667, he launched a war against the Spanish Netherlands. Warfare would be another one of his weaknesses. It's an extravagance that continued to add even more strain to the French economy between his lavish lifestyle. I mean, look at this guy. This is the way he lived. Think of Versailles. Google it. Look at the images. And everything that he was doing, it was all big and outsized and glorious and all this kind of stuff. And he wanted to fight essentially every war because remember, military training, that's how he saw problems being solved was go defeat them on the battlefield. All of these things, well, they cost money. And a lot of it, wars, regardless of whether they have merit or not, are expensive. If you learn nothing else in this class, know that if you're president of the United States or any other place at any one point in time in the future, if you're in charge, just remember what Dr. Grant said about warfare. It's expensive. Whether it's a good idea or not, whether it's justified or not, that's not my concern right now. I just want to let you know it's expensive. There's a reason why defense is the largest budget item in the US budget. Right? It always has been. Wars are expensive. Preparing for war is expensive. Keeping a standing army is expensive. It's a sunk cost. If you're going to go the warfare route, it's going to cost you money. And so he was out there spending money all the time. And there was something other than just money that was a problem with Versailles, right? Versailles, its tremendous size, that even wasn't really the problem, right? Ostentatiousness in the aristocracy, hand in hand, right? I mean, honestly, the pharaohs built pyramids so that they could be buried there, right? You can't get much more ostentatious than that. Aristocracy spends money on themselves in extravagant fashion. We know that, right? As much as we'd like them to think, well, wait a minute, maybe it would be better if we spread this wealth out a little bit. Nah, it's never what they think. It's never what they think. But even that's not really the central problem. It's a visual, it's an optics problem, big time. And it's submarining their economy over time. But there's something even bigger of a mistake in all of this. Versailles, being so big and being so lavish and being so expensive, it meant that that's pretty much where Louis was going to stay. I mean, you got to justify all that expense by living there all the time. And it's so huge that a lot of people live there. I mean, thousands of people live there. Literally. First estate, second estate, the royal family, whole bunch. They camped out there for decades. And they lived lavishly that whole time. Because, I mean, look at the place. But see, before this, before being focused just on Versailles, you didn't build massive palaces, especially during the Middle Ages, because in order for people to understand that they were governed by a king, they needed to see their king, which meant that kings, generally speaking, were on the go rather a lot. You had to actually show up in person to be reminded of the king's power and the king's prestige and the king's authority. You needed to see the king every now and then. If you didn't see the king, it's like object permanence. If I can't see it, it's not there. Right? And that's really important. By remaining in Versailles, he turned the monarchy into something mythic. Great for foreign policy. Make no mistake, right? You walk into Versailles, you are impressed. It blows your mind. And so you've got the greatest home court advantage in the world because it's just so gargantuan. And so when foreign leaders would come, they'd be like, wow, we don't have one of those. And of course, European monarchs tried to build their own version of Versailles wherever they lived. Not great, just on a financial side. But it's also not great for governance. It's cool for foreign policy. You can impress a lot of people that way. But for everyday governance, for internal, domestic affairs, if you never see your king, and you've been trained your whole life to know that to see the king is an important component of granting that person the authority and power to do everything that they do, if you stop seeing your king, that king is reduced to a figment of your imagination, a myth, an idea. And you've depersonalized that king so badly that people stop thinking of him as a person with a spouse and children and all the rest. And that's dangerous in a monarchy. It's why even now, right, in England, the news is always filled with stuff about the royal family. And they recognize that they got to put up with a lot of it, because if you don't see your monarch, you stop thinking you need a monarch, because you don't see the effects of the monarch. And then anything that goes wrong, you can blame on that idea sitting in that preposterous palace that you'll never be able to go inside of, and that you may never even see, but man, you've heard the stories. And so with this lavish lifestyle, and now this kind of homebody attitude, now it's just creating problems. He didn't help himself on one other front. In 1685, right? Make sure you can see this. In 1685, he revoked the Edict of Nantes, right? The Edict of Nantes was the decree of toleration, religious toleration in France during the religious wars, right? He revoked the freedom to worship for all Protestants. And he actually initiated a time of persecution. It was spectacularly dumb. But he had been so indoctrinated, he had been so soaked in the dogma of the French Catholic Church that he believed that this was the right thing to do because he was God's messenger on earth. The French Revolution is clearly not fought against Louis XIV. It'll be his grandson. But he set this ball in motion. He set the works ticking. And that's important because it's his excess. It's his dramatis personae that is going to be the image. This is what people will remember. And this is when the French monarchy went from something to something ugh. And he was there for so long. 72 years. That's a long time to be in charge. It's a long time to be governed by one person with one way of thinking, and it cements all of that. And nobody's ever going to live up to him, no matter who they are. Even if you don't want them to, that's still the image. The Sun King governing over all of this. And so we run into the 18th century. And we've got some things going on. And we can see the causes starting to lay themselves out. absolutism, the divine right of kings, a clearly unjust social, political, economic system that was so frozen into that hierarchical way of thinking and just absolutely cemented with King Louis's reign that nobody thought there was a way to get out. And by cementing all power to himself, there's no pressure relief, right? There's no venting of tension. It just keeps ratcheting up and ratcheting up and ratcheting up, and it's got nowhere to go. Oh, and on top of this, poor harvests year after year after year are going to leave peasant farmers with almost nothing for taxes. And we're going to start to see food shortages. And because the economy has been wrecked, we're going to start to see spectacular inflation. Oh, and on top of that all, right, when we're thinking about long-term causes, things that were a part and parcel of the discussions, remember, the Enlightenment is fully in gear at this point. So is the scientific revolution, but it's the Enlightenment with the philosophes debating all of these things. Mercantilism, which restricts trade and gives all of the best trade agreements to a very small percentage of the population. Oh, and the fact that England killed her king. It all weighs heavy. Oh, and finally, once we get really close, the American Revolution. Remember, France helped us out, and those ideas, they weren't just staying on one side of the Atlantic. People like Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine visited France often, regularly, sometimes for years at a time. Benjamin Franklin and others. You don't think they were sharing their ideas of throwing off the rule of their tyrannical king? This sets us up. It sets us up very nicely. And so what it sets us up for is that next time I'm going to start the French Revolution. Well, me, not personally, but we'll finally get to the beginnings of the French Revolution. This is going to have to unfold over 2 more lectures, right? So there'll be 3 by the time we're all said and done. But be patient. Walk through every step. Don't let your romanticism get the best of you. And let's look at this thing. And let's check it against the criteria that Berman talked about and that I shared with you at the beginning of the lecture. I'm looking forward to the rest of this, and I'm looking forward to your reaction to all of this. Was it a revolution? Was it something different? How do we still feel the reverberations today? Because we do, in small and big ways. Let's see where we go next. And we'll begin the revolution. We'll talk a little bit about short-term causes. We'll talk about the phases of it all, and then we'll get going. Thanks, everybody. I will be posting the next one, hopefully, hopefully by the end of the week. All right? Enjoy your Thanksgiving. See you, everybody.